Good morning. I'm speaking from Idaho Springs, Colorado, an area that was home to one of the early strikes that kicked off the Colorado labor wars of 1903. Behind me, you can see the Argo gold mine. Today this is a tourist attraction, but in the 20th century this was precisely the sort of location that became a focal point for the growing labor discontent in the region. Locations like this are important for understanding the labor history of Colorado, as disputes and strikes in the mining and coalfield communities made the state a region of growing labor activism throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though this activism by no means defined all aspects of Colorado life, it certainly influenced many people. Among these was a man named Ben Salmon. Best known to history as a religious objector during World War I, Salmon was both a devout Catholic and a staunch advocate of labor rights and tax reform. For him, the two were closely linked from his childhood, and later in life when he wrote against the war, his arguments exhibit both the thought processes of religion and labor. Two significant historical works have been written on Salmon: an 1889 biography by Torrin Finney entitled Unsung Hero of the Great War, The Life and Witness of Ben Salmon, and a 2017 article by Michael Baxter entitled On the Front Lines in the Army of Peace, The Life and Witness of Ben Salmon to a Church and a World at War. Both these works place him in his historical context, but primarily within the Catholic Church and tradition, seeing him as a precursor to later religious peace movements. A significant amount has also been written about Salmon from an even more deliberately Catholic perspective, including articles in Catholic magazines, a website dedicated to his canonization, and even a one-act play by Jack Gilroy about his protest during World War I. While most of these acknowledge Salmon's labor activism in passing, there's relatively little focus placed on it compared to the religious aspects of his conscientious objection. These are what take center stage in all of these works. However, by placing Salmon in his historical context of labor-agitated Colorado, through examining his personal and political work, and analyzing his writings for themes of labor and social justice, we can see that his political and philosophical views were just as integral a part of his conscientious objections as his religious beliefs were, if not more so. The aim of this video is to explore Salmon's background and writings, to demonstrate that he was primarily a political protester who drew upon his religious beliefs to support and justify his conscientious objection, rather than the other way around. Idaho Springs, as mentioned, was a notable place where Colorado labor disputes in the early 20th century reached a boiling point. Salmon was about 13 when the mining labor wars began, and although we don't have any record of his specific thoughts or awareness of the disputes at that time, we do know he was strongly influenced by the Ludlow massacre that took place 11 years later during the coalfield wars in southern Colorado. He references this event repeatedly in letters and pamphlets. The two series of conflicts took place in different regions of the state and at different times, but both involved concerns over working conditions and hours, and led to sometimes violent clashes with state and federal forces. These ongoing clashes permeated Colorado culture at the time, and we see that come out full force in a protest letter that Salmon wrote to Woodrow Wilson. While declaiming the draft and war, he narrowed in on the state of the nation from a very Colorado perspective, writing, "Show me any German cruelty that can outdo in horror the massacre of the women and children in the tent colony at Ludlow." Though this letter included some religious basis for his objections, Salmon was quite emotional about events like the massacre, showing true outrage about these social issues and events. As a young man, Salmon's career had followed along with the labor movement. Beginning as a clerk for the Colorado and Southern Railroad, he became involved in political and labor movements, writing articles and pamphlets that eventually led to his dismissal from his job. During this time, he also became part of the single tax movement, and was able to support himself by writing and editing a local newspaper on the theme of economic reform, as well as working as the secretary of the Denver branch of the People's Council of America for Democracy and Peace. These roles bled over into more overt politics when he ran for school board on a platform of increasing economic education in schools, as well as for the state legislature. Despite his religious background and morality, all of these were secular organizations and roles, where he worked in a non-religious manner for social change. By the time World War I grew larger in American consciousness, and Woodrow Wilson won re-election on a peace platform, Ben Salmon's primary focus in day-to-day life was this emphasis on social justice and economic reform. Though he was an active member of the Catholic Church and the Knights of Columbus, and attended a parish school as a child, we know relatively little about his specific religious beliefs before the war. In contrast, we know a significant amount about his burgeoning political views because his writing from the era is from the secular reformist world in which he was most active. To discuss the role of religion in his life and actions, let's head into Denver, where Salmon spent most of his life prior to the war. Shortly before his arrest in 1918 for noncompliance, Ben Salmon married Elizabeth Smith in St. Catherine of Siena Parish in Denver. The St. Catherine of Siena Parish Cathedral behind me was completed in 1915 and is likely where their union took place, though there are no clear public records to verify this. And it is likely here that the Knights of Columbus decided to remove him from their ranks due to his protests in the publication of his 1914 article, "Thou Shalt Not Kill." Although he was financially supporting his new wife as well as his mother, he refused to apply for an official waiver on those grounds. Instead, he insisted on a religious conscientious objection due to his conviction that all killing was morally wrong. To some extent, this was allowed under the Catholic stance on the war, which allowed adherents to follow their conscience. Though in reality, leaders like Cardinal Gibbons called on Catholics to support the war and the government, and the vast majority did so. Only 3 Catholics besides Salmon are mentioned as religious objectors to the war. Their objections varied, though one was motivated by the fact that the U.S. was allied with England, and the English rule in Ireland was something that he staunchly opposed. Indeed, this is one of the many issues that Salmon mentions in his anti-war critiques. Yet, to an overwhelming extent, Catholics, in part led by men like Gibbons and the National Catholic War Council, mobilized in many ways to support the war. Though discounted at the time, Salmon's pacifistic stance has been looked on with increasing respect by more recent Catholic writers. Catholic peace advocates from the Vietnam War and later have attributed Salmon as one of their inspirations, and today there is even a movement within the Church to have him canonized as a saint. The range of the shift is somewhat extreme, considering that during his imprisonment when Salmon resorted to a hunger strike, some priests even refused Salmon the sacraments. This, along with his expulsion from the Knights of Columbus, are clear demonstrations of how his actions alienated him from his religious community. Yet his faith did not waver, and he remained a practicing Catholic. Certainly, Salmon's Catholic beliefs were a fundamental part of who he was, and an important part of his pacifistic development. In his largest work on conscientious objection, a treatise on conscientious objection, which he wrote in 1920, the majority of his argument does focus on religion. Baxter estimates that some 80% of it contains religious arguments and references, and some passages of Scripture are referred to multiple times. For many writers, this is proof of the dominant role of Salmon's religion in his objection, but it's important to note that this particular work functioned as a religious apologetic for his actions, defending himself against the Catholic community. As a result, it has quite a different purpose than his other writings. When we expand our consideration of Salmon's words and writings beyond this treatise, we see constant strands of political and economic thought. Indeed, far more of his works were political than religious. part of this is due to his work in political movements and organizations, but his words were not dictated by these groups, and occasional religious reference still appear within them. They do not, however, dominate his ideas within that context. For further consideration of his political rhetoric that characterized much of his public life, we'll head to one final location. I'm standing now at Argo Park, where a monument to fallen Colorado soldiers of the First and Second World Wars and the Korean War now stands. Just a couple of blocks away stands the Holy Rosary Catholic Church, dedicated in 1920, the year of Salmon's release from federal custody. War and religion, as we can see in Salmon's life among so many others, are often intrinsically linked, but this site has a third connection for Salmon as well. It began as a recreational area for families of workers at the nearby Argo smelter, which in turn found its place due to the proximity of railroad lines. Later, this area was incorporated as the town of Globeville, before becoming a part of Denver proper. It was plagued over the decades of the 20th centuries by issues of public health stemming from pollution from the nearby smelters. Precisely the sort of social issue that would have raised Salmon's ire had he still been in that area. When we look at Salmon's range of publications, pamphlets protesting the war, letters, newspaper editorials, we see a constant focus on social issues like these. Working conditions, pay, labor rights, etc. are far more prevalent than the religious beliefs that perhaps initially inspired him down the path of social justice. For one example, in his 1917 pamphlet, Killing the Wrong Men, Salmon wrote, "America is the land of pauperism. Destitution reigns supreme. To first correct the evils at home, thus setting Germany an example, is a surer way to make the world safe for democracy than by entering our neighbor's domicile demanding he adopt rules that we ruthlessly disregard in our own household. Forcing democracy on Germany while we stifle it at home? Ridiculous." Apparent in this quote is the combative style of Salmon's prose, not geared toward persuasion so much as haranguing. This might in part account for his lack of success in building a more robust peace movement in Denver, as well as conflict that he had with other Catholics. It is also important to note that these social concerns are occasionally linked to his religious beliefs. In the same pamphlet he writes, "Regardless of nationality, we regard all men as our brothers. God is our Father who art in heaven." This is the sole religious reference in the piece, but it does not feel particularly out of place given the moral arguments that he's making. Again, we see political arguments come to the fore in a letter to Secretary of War Baker in 1920, as Salmon tells the story of a fellow inmate who hung himself. He goes on to talk about ongoing conflict all over the war, even after the war to crush militarism has ended, and then with clear sarcasm brings up the issue of Ireland. Quote, "In Ireland alone, England is maintaining an army equal in numbers to that of the entire United States Army. Of course, England is doing this for freedom's sake." Salmon continues on, lamenting the amount of money accumulated by the rich over the course of the war, while poor common men died. In this letter, we again see one brief religious mention in passing, but it in no way forms the backbone of his argument. Salmon's concerns seem genuine. His work for both the single tax movement and the People's Council for Peace show this. For Salmon, the heart of his work was to shift burdens on the poor and improve their lives. Indeed, he ran for the state legislature on grounds of economic policies for the working class. He was not billed as a religious candidate, nor was he openly supported by local Catholic establishments or figures. Rather, he was a respected member of the labor movement, though that changed rapidly upon his arrest and trial. Just as his protests had alienated some within the Catholic Church, shown through his expulsion from the Knights of Columbus, Salmon's decision to plant himself on conscientious objection grounds seems to have alienated the labor community as well. The Denver Labor Bulletin, which previously supported his run for state legislator, called him a nut and noted he had been removed from Denver labor meetings for soliciting funds for the People's Peace Council. Given the rapid shift toward a war footing and the way many public entities supported it, it is perhaps not surprising to see the change in how Salmon was depicted and treated by both groups. To Salmon, all this was connected. Religious conviction was connected to both pacifism and a concern for the working class. In his later writings, we see all these mentioned and linked, but to many in the labor community, pacifism did not necessarily make sense, just as it did not for most American Catholics. However, his role in the two movements has certainly changed over time, particularly due to the peace movement within Catholicism later in the 20th century. Perhaps this explains why the literature on Salmon tends toward an emphasis on his faith. In contrast, labor movements have not always seen the same type of shift toward nonviolence, making Salmon a less likely figure for them to focus upon. As we consider the rationales and thought processes that Salmon's writings reveal, it is clear there was much more to him than religious objections. Those were certainly a part of his convictions, and maybe the root of where they began, but they seem to have blossomed due to the controversial and active labor movements of early 20th century Colorado, which inspired him ever more fervently in his beliefs. Even as he claimed a religious objection to the war, his writings display a great deal of political thought, with strains of economic and working class justice returned to again and again. Ben Salmon was one of very few Catholic objectors to the war and deserves recognition for his dedication to his religious convictions. But he was just as much, if not more so, a political objector. We do him some disservice if we don't acknowledge both sides of his position and how intertwined religion and social justice were in his perspective. And perhaps Salmon can inspire us to consider how connected they can be in our own times 100 years later. Thank you for your time.